Nobody talks about Nazareth. Not really. Ancient writers who catalogued every fortress, every trading post, every road junction across Galilee never wrote down its name. A village of a few hundred people clinging to a limestone ridge above one of the most travelled valleys in the ancient Near East, and the entire literary record of antiquity treated it as if it simply did not exist. Yet this anonymous settlement, invisible to historians, unknown to geographers, absent from every Roman administrative record, is where the story that shaped Western civilization begins. Understanding what Nazareth actually was, what it smelled like, what it cost to survive there, and why everyone who lived in it felt the permanent weight of a world they could not control, changes everything about what the gospel narrative actually means. Stand on the ridge above the Jezreel Valley on a clear morning and look south. The valley stretches 40 kilometers from west to east, flat and dark, with rich alluvial soil, drained by the Kishon River, bounded on the south by the ridge of Mount Carmel and on the north by the limestone hills of Lower Galilee. Caravans move through it. Roman legions have marched through it. Merchants connecting Egypt to Syria pass through it every season. The Jezreel Valley is one of the great corridors of ancient history. Now turn around and look at what is behind you. That cluster of stone-cut dwellings, half buried in the hillside, partially carved from living rock, arranged around small courtyards where goats are tethered and grain jars are stacked against plastered walls, that is Nazareth. And the first thing you notice is that it is not where you would build a city. It does not command the trade route below. It does not sit beside a reliable river. It does not occupy a defensible summit. It sits in a shallow bowl scooped out of the limestone hill, sheltered from the wind, angled slightly inward, as if it is deliberately looking away from the world. Lower Galilee, in the early 1st century, was not a remote or sleepy province. It was a contested, pressured, politically volatile landscape shaped by the collision of Roman imperial ambition, Herodian client rule, and the deep agricultural religiosity of the Jewish communities who had been farming these hills for generations. To understand Nazareth, you have to understand where it sits inside that collision, because the village did not exist apart from those forces. It was shaped by them at every level. The region of Galilee lies in the northern part of the ancient land of Israel, stretching from the Jezreel Valley in the south to the foothills of Lebanon in the north, from the Jordan River and the Sea of Galilee in the east to the Mediterranean coastal plain in the west. Lower Galilee, the southern portion where Nazareth sits, is a landscape of rolling limestone hills, productive agricultural valleys, and a Mediterranean climate that delivers winter rains and long dry summers. The hills are terraced by centuries of agricultural labor, rock walls built by hand to catch eroding soil on the slopes, creating narrow, flat planting surfaces where wheat, barley, olives, and vines could be cultivated. Nazareth sits at an elevation of roughly 350 meters above sea level near the northern edge of the Jezreel Valley. The site shows continuous occupation stretching back to the Bronze Age, but the village that appears in the Gospel accounts, the community of the 1st century CE, was a modest agricultural settlement. Archaeologist Ken Dark, who led the Nazareth Archaeological Project beginning in 2006, describes the settlement pattern as consistent with other small Galilean villages. A compact cluster of household compounds, rock-cut installations, agricultural terraces, and communal facilities concentrated in an area of roughly 4 hectares. 4 hectares. That is a square roughly 200 meters on a side. You could walk end to end across 1st century Nazareth in 3 minutes. The population estimates from archaeological evidence building density, water supply capacity, agricultural land available within a practical daily radius suggest somewhere between 200 and 400 people. Everyone knew everyone. Every marriage was an event the entire community had an opinion on. Every debt was known. Every harvest failure was visible to every neighbor. This is not a cosmopolitan environment. It is a world of sustained, intimate familiarity, which has its warmths and its cruelties in exactly equal measure. The political world pressing down on this village was built by one man's ambition and maintained by Rome's indifference to provincial suffering. Herod the Great, the Rome-backed client king, who had ruled all of Judea and Galilee since 37 BCE, died in 4 BCE. His death immediately triggered revolts across his former kingdom. The revolts reflected the pent-up rage of a population that had spent decades under a ruler who taxed them mercilessly, executed potential rivals without hesitation, and spent the revenues of the Jewish countryside building monuments to his own power in the Roman style. In Galilee, the uprising centered on Sepphoris, a rebel leader named Judas, son of a bandit chieftain Herod had executed years earlier, seized the royal armory at Sepphoris and armed his followers from its stores. The Roman governor of Syria, Publius Quinctilius Varus, the same general who would lose 3 legions in Germany 5 years later, responded immediately. He destroyed Sepphoris and enslaved its population. He moved through the region suppressing the other revolts. When it was over, Josephus records that Varus had approximately 2,000 rebel leaders crucified along the roads of Galilee and Judea. 2,000. Along the roads. If you were a child growing up in Nazareth in the years just after 4 BCE, you grew up knowing what resistance to Rome produced, not in the abstract. On the road to Sepphoris, 6 kilometers away. On the road south toward the valley. You did not need to read history to understand what Roman power meant. You saw its signature in the landscape you walked through. Herod Antipas, who inherited Galilee after his father's death and ruled it as a Roman client tetrarch for the next 4 decades, invested almost immediately in rebuilding Sepphoris. The reconstruction was not a restoration, it was a transformation. Antipas rebuilt Sepphoris as a Roman-style city, colonnaded streets, a public theatre seating approximately 4,000 spectators, public buildings, a sophisticated water distribution system, and residential quarters decorated with mosaic floors. Josephus called it the ornament of all Galilee. The labor to build it came from somewhere. Sepphoris was 6 kilometers from Nazareth. On flat ground, an able-bodied person covers 6 kilometers in an hour and a quarter. A craftsman skilled in stone and wood, a tekton, the Greek word used in the Gospels to describe Joseph's occupation, could make that walk before the morning work hour began and return before dark. Antipas's construction program at Sepphoris was sustained over years. The demand for skilled craftsmen was constant. The wages were real. This is the economic gravity that connected Nazareth to the city that was its opposite in every visible way. The people who built the colonnaded streets went home to rock-cut rooms. The people who shaped the theatre's limestone seats went home to beaten-earth floors. The people who dressed the stone blocks of a Roman-style city went home to a village that no one in the ancient world thought was worth mentioning by name. That gap between the world being built and the world doing the building is not a background detail. It is the central social fact of Nazareth's existence. Walk through the village and look at what the households actually looked like. Excavations conducted over the past century and a half at multiple sites within modern Nazareth have produced a consistent picture of the first-century residential environment. The most significant recent work at the site beneath the Sisters of Nazareth convent, where Ken Dark's team used modern ground-penetrating radar alongside traditional excavation, has uncovered first-century domestic structures that represent the actual built environment Jesus grew up inside. The typical Nazareth household was not a single freestanding building. It was a compound, a cluster of connected spaces that combined above-ground construction with rooms and storage areas carved directly into the limestone bedrock. The rock-cut component was not a basement in the modern sense. It was an integral part of the domestic space. Cooler in summer, warmer in winter, protected from the direct sun, used for grain storage, wine and oil storage, sheltering of domestic animals at night, and during extreme weather, as sleeping space for the household's members. Above the rock-cut areas, walls were built from fieldstone, limestone blocks roughly dressed with iron tools, laid in approximate courses, sealed with a lime mortar, and plastered inside and out with a lime render. The plaster surface was the finished interior face of the room. In wealthier households, it might be painted with simple geometric patterns in red ochre. In Nazareth, it was typically plain white, functional, clean, and reflective enough to distribute the limited light from small, high windows. Windows in a first-century Galilean village house were small and positioned near the top of the wall. The reason was not aesthetic. Large windows admitted heat in summer and cold in winter, invited insects and dust, and compromised the structural integrity of a wall that was never more than 60 centimeters thick. Small, high windows provided ventilation without exposure. They also meant that the interior of the house was permanently dim by modern standards. On a bright summer day, the interior was shadowed and cool. On an overcast winter day, it was dark enough to require lamp lighting for close work even at midday. The lamp providing that light was a small ceramic oil lamp, a shallow dish or enclosed vessel with a wick channel burning olive oil. The light produced by a single lamp of this type is equivalent to roughly 15 to 20 watts of incandescent output. Warm, slightly smoky, sufficient for conversation and eating, inadequate for fine textile work or writing. A household at evening meal might burn 2 or 3 lamps simultaneously. The cost of the oil was real. Lamp oil was not a negligible household expense for a family operating close to subsistence. Multiple related family units shared the compound. Grandparents, parents, unmarried adult children, and newly married sons and their wives before they established independent households, all living within the same set of rooms and courtyard. Privacy, as the modern world understands it, did not exist in this environment. The courtyard was the shared heart of the compound, a surface of beaten earth or rough stone paving, where food was prepared, animals were managed, children played, and the daily social life of the extended family was conducted in conditions of complete mutual visibility. This is where Jesus of Nazareth spent the first 3 decades of his life. Before the day's work began, grain had to be ground. Bread was the foundational food of first-century Galilee, as it was across the ancient Near East. It was ground fresh each morning because whole grain flour goes rancid quickly in the heat of a Mediterranean climate, and because the daily grinding was built into the household rhythm as reliably as sunrise. The millstones used in Nazareth were made from basalt, the black volcanic rock quarried at sites north and east of the Sea of Galilee and distributed across the region by traders. Basalt is harder and more abrasive than limestone, making it effective for grinding grain, and examples have been recovered from virtually every first-century excavation site in Galilee. The upper millstone, the catillus, was rotated by hand over the fixed lower stone, the meta, while grain was fed through a central hole. The rotary motion was sustained for 2 to 3 hours each morning to produce enough flour for a household's daily bread. It was performed primarily by women and female servants, crouching or kneeling beside the millstone in the courtyard or in the lower room of the house, working before dawn, while the rest of the household slept or prepared for the day's labor. The sound of millstones grinding before dawn was the acoustic signature of an inhabited village. The prophet Jeremiah, describing the desolation that would follow divine judgment on Jerusalem, specifically lists the silence of the millstone as one of the markers of total abandonment. The Revelation of John uses the same image, a great millstone thrown into the sea, and the sound of grinding never heard again. For a listener in first-century Nazareth, those passages did not require explanation. The absence of that sound meant the people were gone. The flour produced by basalt millstones was effective, but gritty. Stone particles from the grinding surface wore into the flour with each use. Skeletal analysis of human remains from ancient Israelite and Judean sites, including sites from the period comparable to Nazareth's first-century occupation, consistently reveals extreme molar wear. teeth ground nearly flat from a lifetime of consuming stone dust with every meal. A Nazareth resident of 30 had the dental wear profile of a modern person of 60 or 70. By middle age, the condition of one's teeth affected what foods one could eat. Hard legumes became difficult. Dried fruits required more effort. The diet of the elderly was constrained by the deterioration that the diet of the young had produced. This is the texture of daily life that disappears from Sunday school lessons about biblical Galilee. The grinding teeth, the dim lamp oil, the 2-hour commute to Sepphoris and back. These are not decorative details. They are the actual physical conditions inside which the story being told took place. The bread itself was shaped into flat rounds, either leavened with a sourdough starter maintained in the household, or unleavened when time was short or the occasion required it. It was baked on a ceramic griddle set over a fire or in a clay oven called a taboon, a low-domed structure made from fired clay mixed with organic temper, heated by burning fuel inside it until the dome absorbed enough heat to bake bread pressed against its inner surface or laid on its floor. Taboon bread baked in 4 to 6 minutes. The technique produced slightly charred, chewy, substantial loaves that were the vehicle for every other food in the daily diet. Olive oil was the other essential. Pressed from olives harvested off the hillside terraces in November and December, stored in ceramic vessels in the cool lower rooms of the household compound, olive oil served simultaneously as cooking fat, lamp fuel, skin moisturizer, and trade commodity. Rock-cut olive press installations have been identified in the archaeological record of ancient Nazareth, the large circular pressing platforms, the collection basins cut into the bedrock, the press beam sockets cut into the stone walls. The village produced its own oil as a fundamental part of its agricultural economy. The diet, beyond bread and oil, was supplemented by lentils, chickpeas, dried and fresh figs, olives, seasonal vegetables grown in kitchen gardens, and for those who could afford it, dried fish from the Sea of Galilee processing centers at Magdala, 60 kilometers to the northeast. Magdala, known in the Aramaic sources as Tarikieh, meaning the place of salted fish, operated as a major fish processing industry, salting and drying tilapia and other lake species for distribution inland. Fish reached Nazareth through the trade networks connecting the lake region to the Jezreel Valley. It cost money. For a family operating close to the margin, the purchase of salted fish was a calculation rather than a routine. Meat was eaten rarely, and primarily in the context of the festival calendar. The animal bone assemblages from first-century Galilean village sites show a diet based overwhelmingly on plant protein, with small amounts of sheep, goat, and pigeon. Cattle were too valuable as draft animals to slaughter routinely. Pigs were absent from the Jewish villages of Galilee. The occasions on which a household consumed a significant amount of meat were the religious festivals Passover, Shavuot, Sukkot, when communal sacrifice and shared eating created conditions of relative abundance that did not exist in ordinary daily life. The feast days were not only theologically significant, they were nutritionally significant. They were the 3 or 4 times a year when a family in Nazareth ate differently, better, more. And the contrast between the festival table and the ordinary table was sharp enough that the return from festival abundance to daily subsistence would have been felt physically. The agricultural calendar that produced this diet governed every decision in Nazareth from the first rains of October to the last grape harvest of September. Ploughing began when the autumn rains softened the baked hard soil of the hillside terraces. Iron-tipped ploughs, pulled by oxen or donkeys, broke the surface of the terraced plots, turning the thin, rocky soil to receive seed, wheat, and barley sown through November. The olive harvest ran through November and December, requiring the entire household to work the orchards, beating the olive-laden branches with long poles, spreading cloth beneath the trees to catch the falling fruit, carrying the harvest to the press installation in woven baskets, loading the press, collecting the oil. From December through March, the winter rains sustained the growing grain, and the agricultural household turned to maintenance, repairing terrace walls that had slipped in autumn floods, replastering the interior walls of the household compound, maintaining the cisterns that stored winter rainwater for the dry summer months ahead, cutting new cistern capacity if the household's water storage was insufficient. The grain harvest in April and May was the critical event of the agricultural year. Barley ripened first, wheat 2 to 3 weeks later. Families moved to the fields, the terraced hillside plots that were the basis of their food security, and harvested with iron sickles, binding the cut grain into sheaves, carrying the sheaves to the threshing floor. The threshing floor was a flat, exposed surface of rock or hardened earth at the hilltop, positioned where the prevailing wind was reliable. Threshing was accomplished by driving oxen or donkeys in circles over the piled grain, breaking the stalks and releasing the kernels. Winnowing followed. The broken material was tossed into the wind using wooden forks, the grain falling straight down while the lighter chaff blew away. A good grain harvest meant food security for the year. A poor harvest drought, late frost, locust swarm, crop disease meant the slide toward debt began. 2 consecutive poor harvests meant the debt was already accumulating. 3 poor harvests in a row meant land loss was a real possibility. The anxiety of the harvest season was not a minor emotional note in the background of first-century Galilean life. It was the central drama of the year, the moment on which everything else depended. The grape harvest in August and September concluded the agricultural cycle. The vineyards on the steeper slopes, where grain terraces could not be practically maintained, slopes too steep for plough cultivation, but accessible for hand-cultivated vine rows, produced clusters harvested by hand, carried in baskets to rock-cut wine press installations, treaded by foot to release the juice, the must collected in basin-cut stone reservoirs below the pressing floor and allowed to ferment in large ceramic storage vessels. Wine was not simply a luxury. In a world where water sources were vulnerable to bacterial contamination, particularly during the dry season when cisterns ran low and spring flow diminished, the mild fermentation of wine made it safer to drink than standing water in many circumstances. A household that produced sufficient wine for its own consumption through the year had a genuine survival advantage over one that did not. In this village, the word tekton described a man whose hands shaped the physical world around him and whose status was clearly defined by that work. Joseph is described in the Gospel of Matthew as a tekton. The word is typically translated carpenter in English, but its range in first-century Greek included anyone who worked in structural materials, wood, stone, or both. In a region built from limestone where the houses were cut from rock, the cisterns were carved from bedrock, the wine presses were shaped from living stone, the terrace walls were laid from dressed field stone. A craftsman's work involved stone as much as timber. The wooden components of a first-century Galilean house, roof beams, door frames, furniture were important, but the structural vocabulary of the built environment was stone. A skilled tekton in first-century Nazareth would have been capable of cutting cisterns into bedrock, shaping doorway lintels from limestone slabs, dressing building blocks to approximate regular courses, and repairing the terrace walls that kept the village's agricultural soil from washing down the hillside. These were essential skills. A village without a tekton could not maintain its built environment. But essential and prestigious are not the same thing. The tekton occupied a social tier that was stable without being comfortable, above subsistence farmers who owned no land, below the scribal, priestly, and merchant classes whose occupations connected them to the larger economic networks of the region. A tekton family could feed itself. It could participate in the village social network on equal terms. It was not wealthy, it was not mobile, and it felt the weight of taxation at the same point on the economic scale as every other agricultural household in Nazareth. The Gospel accounts describe Jesus as a tekton himself. Mark's Gospel records the crowd in the Capernaum synagogue asking, "Is not this the tecton, as well as Joseph's son?" The implication is that before his public ministry began, Jesus worked alongside his father in the craft that was the family's livelihood. Sepphoris, 6 kilometers away, was under active construction for much of the childhood and young adult years of Jesus. The Herodian urban project that was transforming Antipas's capital into a Roman-style showcase city would have been the largest source of skilled construction work in the region. Whether Jesus specifically worked in Sepphoris is not stated in the Gospels, but a tecton from Nazareth who was active in the first decades of the 1st century CE would have had strong economic incentives to seek work there. The construction demand was real, the wages were real, and the contrast between the world being built in Sepphoris and the world one returned to in Nazareth each evening was visible every day. Water defined the daily schedule of every household in Nazareth in ways that are almost impossible to internalize from a modern perspective. The spring at the foot of the ancient settlement, now called Mary's Well, incorporated into the Byzantine era and Ottoman period water supply infrastructure of Nazareth, was the community's primary water source. From the spring, water was carried to household compounds in large ceramic storage jars. The standard storage vessel used for household water in 1st century Galilee held between 20 and 30 litres, roughly 25 to 30 kilograms when full. These jars were carried on the head, balanced on a cloth pad, or slung from a shoulder pole. The walk from the spring to a household in the upper part of the village was several hundred meters, uphill. Multiple trips were required each day. Water was used for drinking, cooking, washing hands before eating, ritual purification before prayers and Sabbath observance, watering animals, and wetting the dough for bread baking. A household of 6 to 10 people used a minimum of 40 to 60 litres per day, requiring at least 2 to 3 full trips from the spring for the primary water carrier. The daily water run was women's work. It was also the primary public social space for women in a village culture that otherwise confined female social interaction largely to the household compound. The spring or well was where news travelled, where relationships were managed, where the texture of community life was conducted at the level of individual conversation. The Gospel of John's account of the Samaritan woman at the well, a woman coming to draw water in the heat of midday, avoiding the social environment of the morning water run, carries precise social meaning that is only legible if you understand that the morning water run was a social event, and someone drawing water alone at noon was deliberately avoiding it. Rock-cut cisterns beneath household courtyards provided secondary water storage from winter rain. These cisterns, bottle-shaped or bell-shaped chambers carved into the bedrock, typically holding 8,000 to 15,000 litres, when full were plastered on the interior with a lime hydraulic plaster to prevent seepage and sealed at the top with a stone cover. They required periodic maintenance, replastering when the interior surface cracked and water began to seep out, cleaning to remove the sediment that settled at the bottom over successive seasons. In a year of good winter rains, a well-maintained cistern provided enough supplemental water to carry a household through the dry summer months when the spring's flow diminished. In a drought year, a household with inadequate cistern capacity was dependent on whatever the spring produced, and if the spring failed or diminished severely, the nearest alternative was a significant journey. The daily labor of water management, carrying, storing, rationing, shaped the physical experience of every person in Nazareth, regardless of occupation or social standing. There was no part of daily life that was not organized around water. The morning schedule was built around getting water before the day's heat made the task more difficult. The festival of Sukkot, the autumn harvest festival, included water-drawing ceremonies at the temple in Jerusalem, rituals that connected the cosmological meaning of rain and abundance directly to the physical experience of the people performing them. They were not celebrating water abstractly. They were celebrating it from the specific standpoint of people for whom water was a daily labor and an ongoing anxiety. The synagogue at the center of Nazareth's social life was not what 2,000 years of subsequent Christian and Jewish history might lead you to expect. First-century Galilean village synagogues were not the elaborate liturgical spaces of later periods. The architectural form that produced the mosaic-floored, Torah arch-equipped, inscribed lintel synagogues, visible at Capernaum, Beit Alpha, and dozens of other sites belongs to the 3rd through 6th centuries CE. The 1st century synagogue, the Bet Knesset, the House of Assembly, was a gathering hall. A rectangular room large enough to hold the community's adult population on benches arranged along the walls. A space for Torah reading, teaching, communal decision-making, legal arbitration, and Sabbath assembly. In that space, the community's entire life was conducted in public. Marriage contracts were announced and witnesses assembled. Debt disputes were brought before community elders for resolution. Torah was read aloud in Hebrew on Monday, Thursday, and the Sabbath, the 3 days of the week when the Galilean village community gathered, Monday and Thursday being traditional market and assembly days, in addition to the Sabbath. After the Hebrew reading, an Aramaic Targum, a translation and expansion of the text, was provided for the community's majority, who no longer used Hebrew as a daily language. The Galilean Aramaic spoken in Nazareth was the vernacular of ordinary life, the language of the market, the household, the road, and the workshop. Hebrew was the language of prayer and scripture. The gap between the two was navigated in the synagogue through the Targum tradition and outside the synagogue through the basic biblical literacy that a village community maintained through repeated hearing of the same texts over years and decades. A Galilean Jewish identity in the 1st century was simultaneously intensely devoted to the ancestral law and linguistically, culturally distant from the Judean religious establishment centered in Jerusalem. The Galilean accent was recognizable and carried social meaning. The phrase Galilean, in an urban Jerusalem context, implied a slightly rough northerner, sincere in faith, possibly less sophisticated in legal interpretation, definitely regional in ways that the Jerusalem scribal class could identify immediately. When Peter is identified during the trial of Jesus by bystanders who say, "Your accent betrays you," the Gospel is recording a precise social fact. A Galilean Aramaic speaker in Jerusalem sounded different. Not wrong, not uneducated necessarily, just unmistakably from a specific geographic and social world. That world was Nazareth. 3 times a year, the Jewish festival calendar called the Nazareth community out of its valley and onto the roads that led to Jerusalem. Passover in the spring, Shavuot 50 days after Passover, Sukkot in the autumn. These were the 3 pilgrimage festivals, the Shalosh Regalim, at which Torah required every adult male Israelite to appear before God at the temple in Jerusalem. In practice, economic constraints, distance, and family circumstance meant that not every household made all 3 pilgrimages every year. But Passover was the most observed, and the Luke narrative states explicitly that the family of Jesus traveled to Jerusalem for it annually. Jerusalem from Nazareth was approximately 150 kilometers by the most direct route. The direct route ran south through the Jezreel Valley and then through Samaria, a region whose complicated religious and ethnic relationship with Galilean Jews made the journey uncomfortable or occasionally hostile. Many Galilean pilgrims chose the eastern detour, south through the Jezreel Valley, east to the Jordan River crossing, south along the eastern bank through Perea, back across the Jordan at Jericho, and then the ascent to Jerusalem, a journey of closer to 170 kilometers, taking 5 to 7 days on foot. Pilgrims did not travel alone. They traveled in caravans, village groups, and extended family networks, moving together for safety and mutual support. The caravan was also a social event. Families who saw each other only occasionally reconnected on the road. Traders brought goods to sell at settlements along the way. Young people who had grown up together and might now be betrothed or recently married traveled in the same company they had known since childhood. The caravan's arrival at Jerusalem during Passover was an encounter with a different order of scale. Jerusalem in the early 1st century had a resident population estimated at somewhere between 60,000 and 100,000 people, depending on the methodology of the historian making the estimate. During Passover, that population expanded dramatically as pilgrims arrived from across Judea, Galilee, the diaspora communities in Egypt and Syria and Rome and Babylon. Josephus provides numbers that most scholars consider dramatically inflated. His figure of over 2 million Passover pilgrims in a single year is physically impossible, but even a conservative modern estimate suggests the city's population tripled or quadrupled during the major festivals. For 400 people who had never left the Jezreel Valley, arrival in that city would have been unlike anything in their experience. The Temple Mount was the largest sacred platform in the ancient world. Herod the Great had expanded it to an enormous artificial plateau, roughly 300 meters from north to south and nearly 500 meters from east to west, supported by retaining walls whose lower courses still stand. In the 21st century, the southern retaining wall rose roughly 30 meters above the street level of the valley below it. The colonnaded porticos that ran around the interior edge of the platform were tall enough 10 meters from floor to ceiling that a person standing at the far end could not identify the faces of those at the near end. Ascending to the Temple Mount from the south, on the monumental staircase, a stairway wider than most Galilean village streets, cut from the same limestone as the retaining wall, a Nazareth pilgrim would have emerged onto a stone platform that stretched away in every direction beyond what could be seen from any vantage point at ground level. The noise of the festival crowds, the smell of thousands of sacrificial animals penned in the outer courts, the smoke of continuous sacrifice rising from the altar, the sight of the temple facade itself, gold-plated across its upper surface, white limestone below, so constructed that the morning sun striking the gold created what Josephus describes as a light-emitting effect, visible for miles in every direction. A family from Nazareth standing in the court of the Gentiles during Passover was experiencing something at the absolute opposite extreme from the limestone ridge and the oil lamps and the millstones of home. The entire meaning of the pilgrimage, the sense that the small world of the village was part of a larger story, that the agricultural anxieties and debt pressures and Roman tribute were not the final word about what their lives meant, was enacted in that encounter with scale. And then after 7 days the caravan formed again and the walk home began. Back to the Jezreel Valley, back to the 6 kilometers from Sepphoris, back to the millstones and the spring and the rock-cut rooms. The economics of surviving in Nazareth were defined by a system of overlapping taxation that no agricultural household could escape. Roman imperial tribute was the outer layer. The precise mechanism varied across the 1st century as Roman administrative arrangements in Galilee shifted under Herod Antipas as client tetrarch until 39 CE, then under brief periods of Agrippa's rule, then under direct Roman provincial governance. But the obligation to pay tribute to Rome was continuous. The tribute was assessed on land, a property tax calculated as a percentage of the land's estimated productivity value, and on persons, a poll tax paid by every adult. Both had to be paid in coin, which meant that households producing agricultural goods in kind had to sell or exchange their output to obtain the metal currency that Rome required. Herod Antipas imposed regional taxation on top of the Roman tribute to fund his own projects, Sepphoris. Tiberius, founded around 20 CE on the western shore of the Sea of Galilee as Antipas's second major building project. The construction and maintenance of the infrastructure of a Roman client kingdom required sustained revenue extraction from the countryside. Toll collectors stationed at road junctions, market entries, and river crossings collected fees on commercial transactions and the movement of goods. These toll stations were not distant bureaucratic abstractions. They were physical checkpoints that a Nazareth family encountered on the road to the valley market. The temple system added its own layer. Jewish agricultural households were obligated under Torah law to tithe their produce, a first tithe of 10% of all agricultural output directed to support the Levitical class. A second tithe, an additional 10%, to be consumed in Jerusalem during festival periods or redeemed in cash and donated to the temple treasury. First fruits offerings for specified agricultural categories. Additional contributions for sanctuary maintenance and priestly support. Not every Galilean village household observed all of these obligations in full. The observance rate was a matter of ongoing tension between the rural population and the urban priestly establishment, but the obligations were preached from the synagogue reading platform and enforced by community pressure. Combined estimates of Roman tribute, Herodian regional taxation, and temple tithes, using the best available economic history scholarship on first-century Galilee, range from 30% to over 50% of gross agricultural income. The scholars making these estimates disagree on assumptions, and the estimates are genuinely uncertain, but even the most conservative calculation leaves a family farming terraced hillsides in Nazareth with a substantial fraction of its output diverted to authorities it had no effective voice in. The consequence of this pressure was structural economic fragility. A household operating at the margin of subsistence had no buffer against a bad year. One harvest failure reduced stored reserves. Two consecutive failures required borrowing to meet tax obligations and sustain the household through the year. Loans in the first-century Galilean context carried interest typically at rates that scholars of the period estimate at between 20 and 50% annually, though the specific rates are debated. A family that borrowed to survive a bad year and could not repay by the time the next tax cycle arrived was sliding into a debt spiral. The end of that spiral was land loss. A creditor, typically a larger landowner based in Sepphoris or a temple-affiliated lender in Jerusalem, could call in the debt and claim the land as settlement. A family that lost its ancestral land became a tenant farmer on what had been its own holding, paying a portion of the harvest as rent to an absentee landlord. Or it became a family of day labourers, adult men gathering in the village's public square or the road junction near the market before dawn, waiting to be hired for the day by whoever needed workers, receiving a denarius, roughly a day's subsistence wage if hired, nothing if not. The Gospel's parables are not allegories in a vacuum. They describe this specific economic landscape with the precision of someone who grew up inside it. The parable of the workers in the vineyard hired at various hours of the day and paid equally at day's end. This is a description of the casual labor market of a region with structural underemployment. The parable of the unjust steward who reduces his master's debtor's obligations just before he is dismissed. This describes the relationship between absentee landlord, estate manager, and indebted tenant farmers that was the standard configuration of large agricultural holdings in first-century Galilee. The parable of the prodigal son who demands his inheritance early and loses it. This describes the anxiety about family land fragmentation that was the specific nightmare of every agricultural household in this environment. The parables did not require explanation in Nazareth or Capernaum. They were the local news. Now, here is the detail that almost nobody includes when telling the story of Nazareth. The village does not appear in the Hebrew Bible anywhere. Not once, despite the Bible's extensive geographical cataloguing of Galilean settlements, roads, tribal territories, and landmark towns. Nazareth is simply absent. It does not appear in the writings of Josephus, the first-century Jewish historian who documented Galilean geography in extraordinary detail, naming dozens of villages, describing topography, recording population centers with enough specificity that modern archaeologists have used his accounts as field guides. Josephus wrote about the region around Nazareth. He wrote about Sepphoris extensively. He personally commanded Galilean forces in the region during the revolt of 66 to 70 CE. He never once wrote down the name Nazareth. It does not appear in the Talmudic records of priestly settlement divisions, which listed the towns across Galilee where different priestly lineages relocated after the destruction of the temple in 70 CE. This list catalogues dozens of Galilean villages. Nazareth is not on it. The first non-biblical references to Nazareth appear only in the 3rd and 4th centuries CE, after Christian communities had already identified, venerated, and established pilgrimage infrastructure at the site. Every subsequent literary reference flows from that identification. The village did not achieve a place in the written record until the religion that began there made it worth mentioning. This absence is not evidence of fabrication. The archaeology confirms occupation. First-century domestic structures, agricultural installations, and material culture consistent with a Jewish village community of the early Roman period have been recovered beneath the layers of subsequent construction. The village existed. It was simply too small and too insignificant to penetrate the threshold of anyone's notice. The Gospel of John renders this social geography as a single line of dialogue. When Philip tells Nathanael that he has found the one Moses wrote about, Jesus of Nazareth, Nathanael responds, "Can anything good come from Nazareth?" This is not a literary insult invented by the evangelist to create dramatic contrast. This is Galilean regional geography rendered as speech. Nathanael was from Cana, a village a few kilometers to the north. He knew the social hierarchy of the region. He knew which communities had standing and which did not. Nazareth was at the bottom of the relevant rankings, not because it was wicked or dangerous, but because it was small, agricultural, commercially insignificant, and entirely without cultural distinction. The question was the realistic assessment of a man from the neighborhood. But Nazareth was not simply an anonymous village living in timeless pastoral peace. It was a community living with the specific, accumulated weight of recent history, and that weight shaped everything about its psychology. The revolt of 4 BCE and Varus's response, 2,000 crucified rebels along the roads of Galilee, was not a distant ancestral memory by the time Jesus was born. Herod the Great died in 4 BCE. If Jesus was born in the period described by the Gospel of Matthew during the reign of Herod, before 4 BCE, then the generation of parents who raised the village's children in the first decade CE had personally experienced or witnessed the aftermath of the revolt. The burned city of Sepphoris, the crucifixion sites on the roads, the enslaved survivors. The village of Nazareth, 6 kilometers from the epicenter of the revolt, was not directly destroyed, but it was directly adjacent to the destruction. And the Roman power that had produced that destruction was not a fading memory. It was present every day in the tax collection mechanism, in the soldiers visible on the roads, in the Roman-style buildings rising at Sepphoris that the village's own craftsmen were constructing with their own hands. Jewish messianic expectation in Galilee in the early 1st century was not a vague spiritual yearning. It was a politically specific hope for the end of Roman occupation, for the restoration of Jewish sovereignty, for the reversal of the economic and social conditions that Rome and the Herodian client system had imposed. The synagogue reading from Isaiah, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor, to proclaim liberty to the captives, to set at liberty those who are oppressed," was heard against a background in which the poor were real, the captives were real, and the oppression was a calculation in grain and coin extracted from every farming household in the valley. The messianic texts were not being read as ancient history or abstract theology. They were being read as promises, as a description of what should change, as words that pointed toward a future that the present conditions made feel both desperately necessary and impossibly remote. The community that gathered in the Nazareth synagogue each Sabbath was a community living under sustained pressure, holding its history in one hand and its hope in the other, week after week, year after year, in the most overlooked town, in the most contested province of the Roman Near East. Luke chapter 4 records the moment when everything about this reconstruction snaps into focus. Jesus returns to Nazareth after his period in the Judean wilderness and his early ministry in the synagogues of Galilee. He is known in the village. He grew up there. His father's tecton work is known. His family is known. On the Sabbath, he attends the synagogue, the assembly space where the community of several hundred people has gathered every Sabbath of his life and is handed the scroll of Isaiah. He reads from a passage that begins with the words, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor." This is Isaiah chapter 61. It is a text that, in its first century reading context, carried direct political and economic weight for every person in the room. Good news to the poor was not a generic platitude in a community where poverty meant debt and debt meant land loss. Liberty to the captives was not a metaphor in a region whose grandparents had watched the crucifixion sites on the road from Sepphoris. The year of the Lord's favour, the Jubilee year in which debts were cancelled and land was restored to its original families, was the precise economic miracle that every overtaxed household in Nazareth needed to be real. Jesus rolls the scroll closed, sits down the posture of the teacher about to address the assembly and says, "Today this scripture is fulfilled in your hearing." The reaction that follows is described in two stages. First, astonishment and initial approval. All spoke well of him and marveled at the gracious words coming from his mouth. And then, as he presses the implications, further refusing to perform miracles for his hometown, invoking Elijah's ministry to a Gentile widow at Zarephath, and Elisha's healing of the Syrian general Naaman, rather than to any Israelite, the mood shifts. The crowd rises. They drive him out of the village. They lead him to the brow of the hill on which Nazareth is built. The cliff above ancient Nazareth is real. The northern edge of the ancient settlement ends at a limestone escarpment. It has been identified by archaeologists and is visible today. The crowd's intention was not theatrical. It was the specific action of a community that had been holding the promise of Isaiah for generations, a promise of economic restoration, political liberation, and the reversal of Roman-imposed conditions, and heard in the fine print of the hometown carpenter's teaching that the fulfillment was being offered in a different form than they had been waiting for. Not Nazareth first, not Israel first, not the debt relief and land restoration they needed. Something larger and stranger, and, from the perspective of a household 3 months behind on its grain, tithe significantly less satisfying than what the promise had seemed to offer. The rage was not irrationality. It was the specific response of a community whose hope had been maintained at significant emotional cost and who heard, in the interpretation offered by one of their own, that the cost was going to continue. Understanding Nazareth does not soften this moment. It sharpens it. The crowd at the brow of the cliff is not a mob of malicious actors in a morality play. They are the specific product of a specific environment. Agricultural, indebted, taxed, overlooked, hope-sustained, and capable of fury when the hope that has sustained them is reframed in terms they did not ask for and did not want. The story that began in Nazareth did not stay in Nazareth. Within a generation of the events described in the Gospels, the movement that originated in this invisible Galilean village had communities in Jerusalem, Antioch, Alexandria, Rome, and across the eastern Mediterranean. Within 3 centuries, it had reshaped the religious and political culture of the Roman Empire. Within 2 millennia, it had produced 2 billion adherents and shaped the dominant cultural framework of Western civilization. None of that was visible from the limestone ridge in the 1st century. What was visible was the daily grinding of the millstones before dawn, the walk to the spring and back, the 6 kilometers to Sepphoris and the 6 kilometers home, the tax collector at the road junction near the valley market, the synagogue on the Sabbath, and the reading of Isaiah's promises in a language most people in the room no longer spoke natively. The terraced olive groves in November, the grain harvest in April, and its margin of difference between food security and debt. The most consequential story in Western history began in the place that everyone in the ancient world had already agreed was not worth writing down. That choice of setting is not incidental. It is not a narrative accident. It is the first and most permanent statement of what the story was about. The question that Nazareth leaves open, the question that its limestone walls and rock-cut cisterns and grinding poverty quietly insist on, is whether the 2,000 years of telling this story have told it with sufficient understanding of the world it actually started in. Whether the Galilean village under Roman occupation, the millstone dust in the teeth, the debt accumulating through 3 bad harvests, the memory of the crucified rebels on the road to Sepphoris has ever been as fully present in the telling as the gilded basilicas and the theological systems built on top of it. The village was always there. It was just, as it had always been, overlooked.